In the early 17th century, the first African slaves were brought to North America's shores, marking a dark chapter's beginning in the nation's history. The transatlantic slave trade, which had begun in the late 15th century, saw an estimated 12.5 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic between 1525 and 1866, with around 10.7 million surviving the brutal journey. This human cargo, torn from their homes and families, would become the American economy's backbone for generations. In 1619, the first recorded African slaves, numbering around 20, arrived in Point Comfort, Virginia, aboard a Dutch ship. Though small in scale, this event set the stage for Africans' systematic enslavement in the American colonies. As the Ghanaian scholar and poet Ama Ada Aduo poignantly observed, the story of the African in the Americas begins with a river of tears and a trail of blood. The emergence of slave farms in America was driven primarily by economic motivations. As European colonists settled the New World, they quickly realized the immense potential for agricultural profit. However, the labor-intensive nature of crops like tobacco, cotton, and sugar required a significant workforce. Indentured servants from Europe were initially used to meet this demand, but as the need for labor grew, plantation owners turned increasingly to African slaves. In 1705, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law stating that all slaves were to be held in perpetual servitude, effectively codifying the practice of chattel slavery. This legislation responded to the growing demand for cheap labor and the perceived need to maintain strict control over the African population. Benjamin Franklin, in a 1773 letter to Dean Woodward, lamented the hypocrisy of the slave trade, writing, "Pharisaical Britain! To pride thyself in setting free a single slave that happens to land on thy coasts, while thy merchants in all thy ports are encouraged by thy laws to continue a commerce whereby so many hundreds of thousands are dragged into a slavery that can scarce be saved farm in with their lives." The first slave farm in North America was established in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. By the late 17th century, slavery had become firmly entrenched in the American colonies, particularly in the South. The cotton gin's invention by Eli Whitney in 1793 revolutionized the cotton industry, making it even more profitable and leading to a dramatic expansion of slave farms across the southern states. In South Carolina, for example, the slave population grew from around 7,000 in 1700 to over 100,000 by 1790. This rapid expansion was fueled by the insatiable demand for cotton from the textile mills of the North and Great Britain. As the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison observed in 1831, "We are going to decide the question whether the slaveholding soul-driving system shall be continued, whether the bosoms of our northern freemen shall be made the receptacles of its spoils, and their hearts the abettors of its abominations." The slave farms quickly spread across the American South, concentrating in the coastal regions of South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia, as well as the fertile lands along the Mississippi River in Louisiana and Mississippi. The 1860 United States Census recorded a slave population of nearly 4 million, with the majority living and working on the estimated 46,200 plantations throughout the South. In Louisiana, the number of slaves grew from around 4,000 in 1720 to over 331,000 by 1860, with many working on the state's infamous sugar cane plantations. The Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana, which is now a museum dedicated to the history of slavery, serves as a stark reminder of the slave trade's brutality and scale. As the former slave and abolitionist Henry Bibb wrote in his 1849 autobiography, "Slavery is a system of inhumanity that is founded in blood, cherished in blood, and can only be abolished in blood." Life on these slave farms was brutal and dehumanizing. Slaves were subjected to backbreaking labor, from sunrise to sunset with little rest, and often under the threat of physical punishment. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became a prominent abolitionist, described the conditions on a plantation in his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. The slaves selected to go to the Great House Farm for the monthly allowance for themselves and their fellow slaves were peculiarly enthusiastic. While on their way, they would make the dense old woods, for miles around, reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joy and the deepest sadness. Douglass's vivid account of the slave songs highlights the complex emotions they experienced. A bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow that characterized their daily lives. Another former slave, Harriet Jacobs, who escaped to freedom in the North, described slavery's psychological toll in her 1861 autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Slavery is terrible for men, but it is far more terrible for women. Superadded to the burden common to all, they have wrongs and sufferings and mortifications peculiarly their own. The crops cultivated on these farms varied by region, but the most common were cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane. By 1860, the South was producing 75% of the world's cotton, with the majority grown and harvested by slaves. Tobacco, which had been a staple crop since the colonial era, also relied heavily on slave labor. On Louisiana's sugarcane plantations, slaves endured particularly harsh conditions, working in extreme heat and humidity to cultivate and process the crop. In 1853, Solomon Northup, a freeborn African-American who was kidnapped and sold into slavery, described the grueling work on a Louisiana sugar cane plantation in his memoir, 12 Years a Slave. The hands are required to be in the cotton field as soon as it is light in the morning, and with the exception of 10 or 15 minutes, which is given them at noon to swallow their allowance of cold bacon, they are not permitted to be a moment idle until it is too dark to see. And when the moon is full, they oftentimes labor till the middle of the night. Northup's account underscores the unrelenting nature of slave labor and the inhumane conditions endured by those forced to work on these plantations. The economic impact of slave farms on the American economy was immense. By 1860, the value of the South's slave population was estimated at $3 billion, equivalent to nearly $75 billion today. Slave-grown crops accounted for more than half of all U.S. exports, and the textile mills of the North and Great Britain relied heavily on slave-picked cotton. This economic dependence on slavery made the issue of abolition a contentious and divisive one, ultimately contributing to the American Civil War's outbreak in 1861. In an 1854 speech, the abolitionist Wendell Phillips declared, "The North has nothing to do with slavery, so they say. But slavery has something to do with the North. It enters into its politics, deranges its industry, makes cowards of its public men, corrupts its churches, hardens the hearts of its people, and lowers the standard of its morality." Shadows of the Plantation, the harrowing reality of enslaved life in America. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, the enslaved people of the American South were already toiling in the fields. From the tobacco plantations of Virginia to the cotton fields of Mississippi, an enslaved person's daily life was characterized by back-breaking labor, unimaginable suffering, and the constant threat of violence. In the words of former slave Henry Bibb, "I was a slave, a prisoner for life. I could possess nothing, nor acquire anything, but what must belong to my keeper." This sentiment was echoed by countless others, such as Mary Prince, a West Indian slave who later became an abolitionist in England. In her 1831 autobiography, she wrote, "I have been a slave myself. I know what slaves feel. I can tell by myself what other slaves feel, and by what they have told me. The man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. The living conditions for enslaved people were abysmal, with families often crammed into tiny, dilapidated cabins. At the Magnolia Plantation in South Carolina, archaeological evidence suggests that some slave cabins measured a mere 10 feet by 12 feet, housing up to 10 individuals. Privacy was non-existent, and the meager furnishings typically consisted of nothing more than rough wooden bunks and a few cooking implements. Frederick Douglass, in his 1845 autobiography, described the sleeping arrangements on the plantation where he grew up. The children, unable to work in the field, had neither shoes, stockings, jackets, nor trousers given to them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. Similar conditions were found on plantations across the South, such as the Evergreen Plantation in Louisiana, where the slave quarters consisted of 4 rows of 22 cabins each, housing over 150 slaves at its peak in the mid-19th century. As the abolitionist and former slave sojourner Truth famously declared, "I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out with my mother's grief, 'None but Jesus heard me!' Food was scarce and of poor quality, with enslaved people often subsisting on a diet of cornmeal, pork fat, and molasses. On some plantations, slaves were forced to grow their own vegetables in small garden plots to supplement their meager rations." In his 1853 memoir, Solomon Northup recounted the inadequate provisions given to slaves on a Louisiana plantation. The allowance of each slave per week was a peck of corn and 3 or 4 pounds of pork, or in lieu of pork, a bushel of sweet potatoes, with a modicum of salt, which they used to boil their hominy and season their greens. This sparse diet led to widespread malnutrition and diseases such as pellagra, a vitamin deficiency that causes diarrhea, dermatitis, and dementia. The workday for enslaved people was long and grueling, typically lasting from sunrise to sunset. On cotton plantations, slaves were expected to pick a minimum of 200 pounds of cotton per day, a task that left their fingers bloody and their bodies exhausted. Failure to meet these quotas often resulted in severe punishments, such as whippings, beatings, or even mutilation. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass described plantation overseers' brutality. "The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest, there he whipped longest." This violence was not limited to adults. Children as young as 3 or 4 were put to work on plantations, often as water carriers who brought water to field hands or as babysitters for the plantation owners' children. In 1852, the escaped slave and abolitionist Moses Roper wrote of his experiences. "I have often seen the overseer beat my mother when she was in travail, and he would make her get up and go to work almost as soon as she was delivered of her child." Medical care for enslaved people was virtually non-existent, with plantation owners often viewing slaves as expendable commodities. Diseases like cholera, dysentery, and pneumonia ran rampant through slave quarters, claiming countless lives. In some cases, enslaved women were subjected to medical experimentation, such as the infamous surgeries performed by J. Marion Sims, who operated on enslaved women without anesthesia in the 1840s. This lack of basic medical attention contributed to the high mortality rates among enslaved populations, with the average life expectancy of a slave in 1850 being just 21.4 years. On some plantations, the infant mortality rate was as high as 50%. As former slave and abolitionist Sarah Parker Remond observed in an 1859 speech, "The slave mother's heart bleeds when she thinks of her children, for she knows not at what moment they may be torn from her bosom and sold, where she may never more behold them." With the psychological impact of slavery on those who endured it cannot be overstated. Families were torn apart. with children ripped from their mothers' arms and sold to distant plantations. The mistreatment of enslaved women by white slaveholders was rampant, as illustrated by the tragic story of Celia, an enslaved woman in Missouri who was repeatedly subjected to unwanted advances by her owner and later executed for killing him in self-defense in 1855. The constant fear, degradation, and trauma experienced by enslaved people left deep scars that echoed through generations. As the former slave and abolitionist William Wells Brown wrote in his 1847 memoir, "Slavery has fixed a deep gulf between the two races, a dark abyss, into which I fear both the oppressed and the oppressor will ultimately fall." This trauma was compounded by enslaved people's systematic dehumanization, who were treated as property rather than human beings. Sparks of defiance, resistance and rebellion in the face of slavery. In the suffocating darkness of the slave quarters, whispers of resistance drifted through the air like wisps of smoke. From the tobacco fields of Virginia to the sugarcane plantations of Louisiana, enslaved people across the American South fought against their oppressors in ways both subtle and overt, risking their lives for a chance at freedom. As Harriet Tubman, the famed conductor of the Underground Railroad, once said, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." One of the most common forms of resistance was the work slowdown, a tactic that allowed enslaved people to assert some control over their labor. By feigning illness, breaking tools, or simply working at a glacial pace, they could sabotage the plantation's productivity and frustrate their overseers. In his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, Douglass recounted how he and his fellow slaves would sometimes make the dense old woods for miles around reverberate with their wild songs, using music as a way to resist slavery's dehumanizing effects. This tactic was also employed by enslaved people on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, who developed a unique musical tradition known as the shout, a rhythmic call and response style of singing and dancing that served as both a form of spiritual expression and a way to communicate covertly in their overseer's presence. Escape attempts were another form of resistance, with countless enslaved people risking their lives to flee the plantations that held them captive. The Underground Railroad, a clandestine network of routes and safe houses, helped thousands of slaves escape to freedom in the North and Canada. Harriet Tubman, born into slavery in Maryland around 1820, became one of the Underground Railroad's most celebrated conductors, leading an estimated 70 slaves to freedom over 13 missions. Her courage and tenacity earned her the nickname Moses, a testament to her role as her people's deliverer. Another notable figure in the Underground Railroad was William Still, a free-born black man who helped over 800 enslaved people escape to freedom as the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society's Vigilance Committee director. In his 1872 book, The Underground Railroad Records, Still wrote, "The heroism and desperate struggle that many of our people had to endure should be kept green in the memory of this and coming generations." While individual acts of resistance were common, enslaved people also staged larger-scale revolts and rebellions that shook the slaveholding South's foundations. In 1739, the Stono Rebellion saw around 20 enslaved Africans march through the South Carolina countryside, recruiting fellow slaves and killing at least 20 white people, before being suppressed by militia forces. The rebellion, which lasted several days and covered over 20 miles, struck fear into white slaveholders' hearts and led to even more oppressive slave codes passage. The rebels, led by a man named Jemmy, were heavily influenced by the Catholic teachings they had been exposed to in the Spanish colony of Florida. where many had been previously enslaved. As historian Peter H. Wood wrote in his book Black Majority, the Stono Rebellion was the largest and bloodiest revolt ever staged in Britain's mainland North American colonies. Another significant uprising was the 1831 rebellion led by Nat Turner in Southampton County, Virginia. Turner, a deeply religious man who believed God had chosen him to lead his people to freedom, gathered around 70 enslaved and free black people and embarked on a campaign of violence against white slaveholders. Over 2 days, Turner and his followers killed an estimated 55 white people before militia forces captured them. The rebellion sent shockwaves through the South, leading to heightened paranoia among white slaveholders and even stricter laws governing enslaved people's lives. In the rebellion's aftermath, Turner was captured, tried, and hanged, but his legacy lived on as a resistance symbol and a warning to those who would seek to keep black people in chains. As Turner himself declared before his execution, "I am here loaded with chains, but this is nothing compared to the chains with which I have been bound by my fellow creatures." The German Coast Uprising of 1811, which took place in Louisiana, was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. Led by Charles Deslandes, an enslaved man originally from Haiti, the rebellion involved an estimated 200 to 500 slaves who marched on New Orleans to establish an independent black republic. The rebels, armed with cane knives and makeshift weapons, burned plantations and killed several white people before militia forces brutally suppressed them. In the uprising's aftermath, over 100 slaves were killed, many beheaded and their heads displayed on pikes as a warning to others. The rebellion was heavily influenced by the Haitian Revolution of 1791-1804, which saw enslaved people overthrow their French colonial oppressors and establish the Americas' first independent black republic. As one of the rebel leaders, Cook declared during the uprising, "We will show these whites that we are men, not beasts of burden." Despite the brutal reprisals that followed these rebellions, the spirit of resistance could not be extinguished. As William Wells Brown, a former slave and abolitionist, wrote in his 1847 memoir, "The slave has been deprived of his rights, his liberty, and even his name. He is a thing, a chattel personal, a piece of property, a marketable commodity, and yet he is a man, with all the attributes of manhood and all the feelings and affections of humanity." This sentiment was echoed by Maria Stewart, a free black woman who became one of the first women to speak publicly against slavery in the 1830s. In an 1833 speech, she declared, "O, ye daughters of Africa, awake, awake, arise! No longer sleep nor slumber, but distinguish yourselves. Show forth to the world that ye are endowed with noble and exalted faculties." The engine that built an economy. Slavery's central role in America's rise. In the sweltering heat of the southern sun, the rhythmic sounds of pickaxes and shovels reverberated through the sprawling cotton fields. From sunup to sundown, enslaved men, women, and children toiled under their overseers' watchful eyes, their labors fueling the economic engine that would propel the United States to global prominence. As the abolitionist Frederick Douglass observed in his 1845 memoir, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, the slaveholding regime regards the slave not as a sentient being, but as a thing, a commodity, an article of merchandise, a chattel. This dehumanizing view was codified in law, as evidenced by the 1705 Virginia Slave Code, which declared that all Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves shall be held, taken, and adjudged to be real estate. The slave labor's economic importance to the American economy, particularly in the southern states, cannot be overstated. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States, representing a staggering 13.3% of the total population. The vast majority of these individuals were concentrated in the South's agricultural regions, where they formed the plantation system's backbone. On the Civil War's eve, enslaved people's value as property was estimated at $3.5 billion, equivalent to approximately 10 trillion in today's dollars, as historian Walter Johnson notes in his book River of Dark Dreams. Slavery and Empire in the Cotton Kingdom. Slavery was not just a labor system, it was the nation's largest financial asset, worth more than all of America's railroads and factories combined. This point was underscored by the 1860 U.S. Census, which revealed that the South's enslaved population's value was greater than all the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined worth. The profits generated by slave labor were not confined to the plantation owners themselves, but rather permeated every aspect of the American economy. The cotton picked by enslaved hands in the South was shipped to textile mills in the North, where it was transformed into cloth for clothing and other goods. By 1850, cotton constituted more than half of all U.S. exports, and these exports' revenues helped finance the nation's westward expansion, its cities' growth, and its burgeoning industries' development, as Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina famously declared in an 1858 speech, "Cotton is king, and no power on earth dares to make war upon it." Cotton is king. This sentiment was echoed by James D. Bowe, a prominent Southern economist and statistician, who wrote in his influential journal, D. Bowe's Reviews, "The cotton crop of the United States is the wonder of the age and the chief source of our power and influence abroad. The profits from slave labor did not merely line Southern plantation owners' pockets, but also flowed northward, fueling industries and financial institutions' growth. New England textile mills, in particular, were heavily dependent on Southern cotton, and many of the region's most prominent families, such as the Lowells and the Appletons, owed their fortunes to the slave trade. As historian Eric Funner notes in his book, The Fiery Trial, Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery, the slave economy of the Southern states had ripple effects throughout the United States, with plenty of merchants in New York City, Boston, and elsewhere profiting from the slave trade and investments in slave-powered industries. This point was driven home by the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who declared in an 1831 speech, "Every man who eats the bread of slavery is a man-stealer, and deserves to have his name recorded among felons and handed down to posterity as an object of universal execration." Slavery's economic reach extended beyond the United States borders as well. The cotton picked by enslaved laborers fed Great Britain's textile mills, fueling the Industrial Revolution and cementing the United States' position as a major player in the global economy. By 1860, nearly 80% of the cotton consumed by British textile mills came from the American South, and this trade's revenues helped finance vast transportation networks, construction, including railroads and canals that would facilitate American commerce's further expansion. As historian Sven Beckert notes in his book Empire of Cotton, A Global History, cotton, and with its slavery, became the driving force of a new, globally interconnected economy that reshaped the world. Slave labor's economic impact was not limited to the agricultural sector, however. Enslaved people were also put to work in a wide range of other industries, from ironworks and mines to lumber mills and shipyards. In cities such as Charleston and New Orleans, enslaved labor worked as dock workers, construction workers, and domestic servants, their labors integral to the urban economy's functioning. As historian Ira Berlin writes in his book, Many Thousands Gone, The First 2 Centuries of Slavery in North America. Slavery was not a sideshow in American history, but the main event. This point was underscored by the fact that, In 1860, nearly half of all enslaved people in the United States lived in cities and towns, rather than on plantations. The profits generated by slave labor helped create a small but immensely wealthy class of plantation owners who wielded enormous political and economic power. These individuals, known as the slaveocracy or the planterocracy, dominated Southern society and politics, using their influence to shape national policies on issues such as tariffs, banking, and westward expansion. As South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun declared in an 1837 speech, "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin, and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slave-holding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good." This view was echoed by Mississippi Senator Albert G. Brown, who declared in an 1858 speech, "I believe that slavery is a positive good, that it is a necessary institution, that it is the only relation which can exist between the two races, and that it is the duty of every Southern man to maintain and defend it." Slavery's economic importance was not lost on those who sought to abolish the institution. In his 1854 book, Slavery and the Internal Slave Trade in the United States, abolitionist Theodore Dwight Weld wrote, "The blood of the slave is the seed of the cotton plant, and all its profits are steeped in the sweat and tears and blood of the bondman." This sentiment was echoed by Frederick Douglass, who declared in an 1852 speech, "The slave is the foundation of our commerce, the cornerstone of our republicanism. He is the sinew of our strength, the bone of our prosperity." The abolitionist movement gained momentum in the 1830s and 1840s as activists such as William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Sojourner Truth worked to expose slavery's brutal realities and galvanize public opinion against the institution. Slavery's economic impact would ultimately prove to be a double-edged sword for the United States. While the institution generated immense profits and fueled the nation's rise to global prominence, it also sowed the seeds of regional division and conflict that would eventually lead to the Civil War. As Abraham Lincoln observed in his second inaugural address, delivered in the conflict's waning days, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Whispers in the quarters, the hidden world of enslaved culture and community. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound of hushed voices and muffled laughter drifted through the cramped, dimly lit slave quarters. In these moments of respite from the field's back-breaking labor, enslaved men and women gathered to share stories, songs, and memories of a homeland many had never seen. Born into bondage on the American South's plantations, they had been stripped of their freedom, their dignity, and even their names. Yet, despite slavery's dehumanizing conditions, these individuals managed to forge a rich cultural heritage and a sense of collective identity that would endure for generations. As the former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote in his 1855 autobiography, "My Bondage and My Freedom," the slave's happiness is not the end sought by slavery. It is, indeed, a conceded point that to make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one. It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision and, as far as possible, to annihilate his power of reason. Enslaved communities, cultural practices, and traditions were shaped by their members, diverse African backgrounds. Torn from their native lands and thrust into a foreign world, enslaved Africans brought with them a wealth of knowledge, skills, and beliefs that would form a new, distinctly African American culture's foundation. As historian Ira Berlin notes in his book, Many Thousands Gone, The First 2 Centuries of Slavery in North America, the African diaspora was a cultural diaspora, and the men and women who were swept up in it carried with them their language, their religion, their aesthetic sensibilities, their ways of knowing and doing. This cultural diversity was reflected in the various ethnic groups represented among the enslaved population, including the Akan, Yoruba, Igbo, and Mandinka peoples of West Africa. One of enslaved culture's most important aspects was African religious traditions preservation. Despite slaveholders' efforts to convert their human property to Christianity, many enslaved people continued to practice their native religions in secret. Historian Albert J. Roboto, in his book Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution, in the antebellum South, estimates that only about 10% of enslaved people in the United States were Christians by 1860. The rest maintained a rich spiritual life rooted in African traditions such as Vodun, Santeria, and Conjure. These practices often involved charms, amulets, and herbal remedies to protect against evil spirits and cure illnesses. As one former slave, William Wells Brown, recalled in his 1847 autobiography, Narrative of William W. Brown, a Fugitive Slave, "There was not a man or woman on the plantation but that believed in conjuration, and some of them had great faith in their own powers of conjuring." These religious practices often took place in hidden locations, such as the secluded woods or plantations, remote corners, where enslaved people could gather to pray, sing, and dance without punishment fear. These gatherings, known as brush arbor meetings or hush harbors, provided a rare opportunity for enslaved people to express themselves freely and connect with their spiritual traditions. Music and dance were another enslaved culture's crucial element, serving both as an expression means and a resistance form. Work songs, spirituals, and field hollers provided a rhythmic accompaniment to the plantation's grueling labor, while also allowing enslaved people to communicate with each other and express their deepest emotions. As historian Lawrence Levine writes in his book, Black Culture and Black Consciousness, the spirituals are full of coded messages, of double meanings, of metaphors which not only describe the slave's relationship to God, but their relationship to their masters and to the institution of slavery itself. Songs like "Steal Away to Jesus" and "Wade in the Water" contained hidden messages about escape and resistance, while others like "Swing Low," "Sweet Chariot," and "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child" expressed the enslaved experience's profound sorrow and longing. Enslaved people also used music and dance to preserve their African heritage and create a community sense. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, enslaved Africans in New Orleans gathered on Sundays in the city's Congo Square to dance, sing, and play traditional African instruments such as the banjo and the drum. These gatherings, which drew both enslaved and free people of color, helped keep African cultural traditions alive and provided a rare opportunity for social interaction and self-expression. As one observer wrote in 1890, "The African slaves meet on the green by the swamp and rock the city with their Congo dances." Similar gatherings took place on plantations throughout the South, where enslaved people would come together to perform the ring shout, a rhythmic, circular dance that incorporated African spirituality and European folk traditions elements. Family and kinship networks were another enslaved culture and identity's critical aspect. Despite the constant threat of separation through sale, Enslaved people formed close, knit communities based on shared experience, cultural traditions, and blood ties. Extended family networks, often stretching across multiple plantations, provided a belonging and support sense in unimaginable hardships face. As historian Herbert Gutman notes in his book The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750–1925, the most significant social unit in the slave quarters was the family household, defined as a group of people who regularly shared a common residence and common food supply. These households often included multiple family member generations as well as fictive kin, who were not related by blood, but had been informally adopted into the family. Family's importance in enslaved culture is reflected in enslaved people's naming practices. Many enslaved parents gave their children African names, such as Cudjoe, Quash, and Mina, as a way of connecting them to their ancestral heritage. Others used familial surnames to mark their kinship ties, even if they had no legal right to do so. As historian Brenda Stevenson writes in her book Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, surnames provided a means for slaves to assert their own sense of self and kin in a world that denied them legal identities. This practice is exemplified by Sojourner Truth's story, who was born into slavery in New York in 1797 with the name Isabella Baumfree, but later chose the name Sojourner Truth to reflect her new identity as a free woman and an activist for abolition and women's rights. Enslaved communities, cultural practices, and social structures also served as a resistance means against slavery's dehumanizing conditions. By maintaining their own traditions, values, and ways of life, enslaved people asserted their humanity and challenged the notion that they were mere property. As Frederick Douglass wrote in his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, the slave system, in its whole and in its details, was utterly hateful to me. I hated it in all its aspects, its wrongs, its injustice, its immorality, its degradation, its brutality. I hated the coffle gang, the slave driver, the whip, the fetter, and the branding iron. I hated everything that reminded me of my condition. The Unshackling, America's long march toward emancipation. In the flickering candlelight of a small New England church, a group of men and women gathered, their faces etched with determination. It was the year 1831, and these brave souls had come together to form the New England Anti-Slavery Society, one of the first organized abolitionist movements in the United States. Among them was William Lloyd Garrison, a fiery editor and journalist who would become one of the fight against slavery's most influential figures. In his newspaper, The Liberator's inaugural issue, Garrison boldly declared, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation." Garrison's uncompromising stance was shared by many of his fellow abolitionists, including the Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier, who wrote in his 1833 poem, "The Slave, Ships, no more shall the sighing of the slave, the shrieks of his tortured kindred, rise day in dread appeal to the pitying skies. The voice of the bondman shall be heard, ringing in freedom's holy word." Garrison's words echoed the growing sentiment among a small but vocal group of Americans who believed slavery was a moral abomination that had to be eradicated. The abolitionist movement had its roots in the Quaker community, which had been advocating for slavery's abolition since the late 17th century. In 1775, the Quaker abolitionist Anthony Benezet founded the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, the first abolitionist society in North America. Benezet, who had been born in France and immigrated to Philadelphia in 1731, was a tireless advocate for African Americans' rights, and his writings helped inspire an abolitionist generation. as he wrote in his 1762 pamphlet, A Caution and Warning to Great Britain and Her Colonies. The Negroes are our fellow creatures, and have immortal souls. They have the same right to liberty that we have. They have the same natural affections, and are equally sensible of pain and grief. However, it wasn't until the early 19th century that the movement began to gain wide traction. Thanks largely to black abolitionists' efforts, such as Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery in 1838 and became one of the anti-slavery cause's most powerful voices. Born into slavery in Maryland in 1818, Douglass had been taught to read and write by his owner's wife, a rare and dangerous act that was strictly forbidden by law. After escaping to the North, Douglass quickly became a prominent figure in the abolitionist movement, using his oratorical skills and his personal liberation story to sway public opinion. In his 1845 autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, Douglass wrote, I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. The abolitionist movement faced significant obstacles, not least of which was the slaveholding states' deeply entrenched economic and political power. In the Republic's early days, slavery had been a contentious issue, with many of the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, expressing moral qualms about the practice. In his 1785 Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson wrote, The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. However, the cotton gin's invention in 1793 had made slavery hugely profitable, and by the mid-19th century, the southern states were heavily dependent on slave labor to sustain their agricultural economy. As a result, any attempt to abolish slavery was met with fierce resistance from southern politicians and plantation owners. Despite these challenges, the abolitionists persisted in their efforts to bring the peculiar institution to an end. One of the early abolitionist movement's most significant moments came in 1831 when Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher in Virginia, led a rebellion that resulted in over 50 white people's deaths. The Turner Rebellion sent shockwaves through the South and sparked a repressive legislation wave aimed at controlling the enslaved population. However, it also galvanized the abolitionist movement, which saw Turner as a martyr in the fight against slavery. In his 1832 pamphlet, The Confessions of Nat Turner, Thomas R. Gray, the lawyer who interviewed Turner before his execution, wrote, He is a complete fanatic, or plays his part most admirably. On other subjects, he possesses an uncommon share of intelligence, with a mind capable of attaining anything, but warped and perverted by the influence of early impressions. In the decades that followed, the abolitionist movement continued to gain momentum, thanks largely to activists like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman's tireless efforts. Sojourner Truth, who had been born into slavery in New York and escaped to freedom in 1826, became one of the anti-slavery and women's rights movement's most powerful voices. In her famous 1851 speech, Ain't I a Woman?, delivered at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, Truth declared, That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman? As the abolitionist movement gained strength, so too did the backlash against it. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which required northern states to return escaped slaves to their southern owners and imposed harsh penalties anyone who aided in their escape. The act was met with outrage in the North, where many people saw it as their moral and religious principles violation. In her 1852 novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became a sensation and helped turn public opinion against slavery, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote, "The law of God, written on the heart, cannot be repealed by any human enactment." The Stowe's novel, which told the story of a kind and pious slave named Uncle Tom and his cruel master, Simon Legree, became a rallying cry for the abolitionist movement and helped mobilize public opinion against slavery's evils. Despite the opposition, the abolitionist movement continued to build momentum throughout the 1850s, thanks in part to the North and the South's growing sectional tensions. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed those territories' residents to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The act led to a period of bloody conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, as pro- and anti-slavery forces battled for the territory's control. The violence in Kansas, along with the ongoing debate over slavery's expansion into new territories, helped fuel the Republican Party's rise, which was founded in 1854 on a slavery opposition platform. As the party's first presidential candidate, John C. Frere Munt declared in his 1856 campaign slogan, "Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men." Abraham Lincoln's election as president in 1860 marked a turning point in the struggle over slavery. Lincoln, who had opposed slavery's expansion into new territories, was seen as a threat to the Southern way of life, and his election prompted 7 Southern states to secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The Civil War that followed would ultimately lead to slavery's abolition, thanks largely to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which declared that all slaves in rebel states were forever free. As we delve into slavery farms' history, it's vital to remember those who endured unimaginable hardships, names, and faces. From Harriet Tubman's courageous escapes, harrowing tales to Frederick Douglass's poignant words. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. These stories remind us of the human spirit's resilience and strength. Reflecting on this dark chapter, we honor their memory and vow to learn from the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop seeking justice. Good